Chapter 3. The Bermuda Triangle. What is it about this infamous stretch of ocean and sky that causes ships and planes to vanish without a trace? At 2:10 in the afternoon of December 5th, 1945, 5 US Navy Avenger torpedo bombers took off from a naval air station at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The commander of Flight 19, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, had been assigned a routine 2-hour training flight of 15 men on a course that would take them out to sea 60 miles due east of the airbase to the Hen and Chicken Shoals. There the squadron would carry out practice bombing runs and then fly due north for 75 miles before turning for a second time and heading back to base, by then 120 miles away. Their plotted flight plan formed a simple triangle, straightforward to execute, and Lieutenant Taylor and his 4 trainee pilots headed out into the clear blue sky over the calm Saragossa Sea. Even though everything seemed set fair, some of the crew were showing signs of anxiety. This was not unusual during a training flight over open water. What was less usual was that one of the 15 crewmen had failed to show up for duty, claiming he had had a premonition that something strange would happen on that day and he was too scared to fly. And within a few minutes of takeoff, something strange did happen. First, Lieutenant Taylor reported how the sea appeared to be white and not looking as it should. Then shortly afterwards his compasses began to spin out of control, as did those of the other 4 pilots, and at 3:45 p.m, about 90 minutes after takeoff, the normally cool and collected Taylor contacted Lieutenant Robert Cox at Flight Control with the worried message, "Flight Control, this is an emergency. We seem to be off course and we can't make out where we are." Cox instructed the pilot to head due west, but Taylor reported that none of the crew knew which way west actually was. And that too was highly unusual, as even without compasses and other navigational equipment at that time of day, and with the sun only a few hours from setting, any one of them could have used the tried and tested method of looking out of the window and following the setting sun, which will always lie to the west, of wherever you are, wherever you find yourself. Just over half an hour later, Taylor radioed Flight Control again, this time informing them that he thought they were 225 miles northeast of base. His agitated radio message ended with him saying, "It looks like we are," and then the radio cut out. By then they would have been desperately low on fuel, but the 5 Avengers had been designed to make emergency sea landings and then remain afloat for long enough to give the crew a chance to evacuate into life rafts and await rescue. A Martin Mariner boat plane was immediately sent out to assist Flight 19 and bring the men back, but as it approached the area in which the stricken crew were thought to have been lost, it too broke contact with Flight Control. None of the aircraft and none of the crew were ever found, and the official Navy report apparently concluded that the men had simply vanished as if they had flown off to planet Mars. To this day, the American military has a standing order to keep watch for Flight 19 as if they believed it had been caught up in some bizarre time warp and might return at any time. At least, that's how the story goes. And it would have had a familiar ring for some, as it wasn't the first time a mysterious disappearance had been reported in that area. Indeed, on the 9th of March 1918, the USS Cyclops had left Barbados with a cargo of nearly 11,000 tons of manganese, which is a hard metal essential for iron and steel production, and it was bound for Baltimore on the east coast of America. The following day, Lieutenant Commander G.W. Worley, a man with the habit of walking around the quarterdeck clad in nothing but his underwear and a hat and carrying a cane, reported how an attempted mutiny by a small number of the 306-man crew had been suppressed and that the offenders were now below decks in irons. And that was the last time anybody ever heard from Captain Worley or any of his crew. The 20,000-ton Cyclops simply vanished from the surface of the sea into thin air. The conclusion at the time was the ship had been a victim of German U-boat activity, but when investigations in Germany after the end of the First World War revealed that no U-boats had ever been located in that area, that theory had to be ruled out. Instead, speculation ranged from the suggestion, preferred quite seriously by a popular magazine, that a giant sea monster had surfaced, wrapped its tentacles around the entire ship and dragged it to the ocean bed and eaten it. Another rumour, thanks to UFO hysteria, as a result of the famous Aurora spaceship mystery, was that the vessel had been lifted via giant magnets into outer space. And then, in 1963, 18 years after the disappearance of Flight 19, it happened again. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen was on a voyage from Norfolk, Virginia to Belmont in Texas. On the 3rd of February, the ship radioed a routine report to the local Coast Guard to give her position. She was at the time sailing close to Key West in the Straits of Florida. Shortly afterwards, she vanished. 3 days later, the Coast Guard, searching for any sign of the missing vessel, found a single life jacket floating in the sea. Since then, no other evidence of the Marine Sulphur Queen, its cargo, or the 39-man crew has ever been found. Back in 1950, connections had already been made between the disappearance of Flight 19 and that of the USS Cyclops. Reporter E.V.W. Jones was the first to suggest mysterious happenings in the sea between the Florida coast and Bermuda. 2 years later, Fate magazine published an article by George Sand in which he suggested that the mysterious events, thousands of them by his calculation, had all taken place within an area that extended down the coast from Florida to Puerto Rico and in a line from each of these to Bermuda, creating what he called a watery triangle. His views were shared by one Frank Edwards, who published a book in 1955 called The Flying Saucer Conspiracy, in which he claimed that aliens from outer space were also operating in the same area, which meant the sky was now included, and so the watery triangle became known as the Devil's Triangle. In 1963, following the disappearance of the Marine Sulphur Queen, journalist Vincent Gaddis wrote an article for Argosy magazine in which he drew together the many mysterious events that had taken place within the triangular area of sky and sea. Notice how it's now 1963 and so far there's no mention of the Bermuda Triangle. As far as the public were concerned, there was no such place. It didn't exist. But when Gaddis realized how popular his article had become, he decided to extend it and included many more mysterious events, and put them all together in a book which he called The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, thereby coining the now famous expression that was to become synonymous with unexplained disappearances the world over. 11 years later, a book by former Army intelligence officer Charles Berlitz, simply called The Bermuda Triangle, sold over 20 million copies and was translated into 30 different languages. In 1976, the book won an international prize for non-fiction, and the world became gripped by Bermuda Triangle fever, and has been ever since. Geographically, the Bermuda Triangle covers an area in the western Atlantic marked by, at its 3 points, Bermuda, San Juan in Puerto Rico, and Miami in Florida. Although on closer study of the locations of some of the ocean disasters attributed to the myth, it would be easy to extend that area halfway around the world. The Mary Celeste, for example, which we cover in this volume, has even been connected to the Bermuda Triangle, and that would extend its boundaries closer to Portugal. But could there be any truth in the myth anyway? Some more prosaic explanation to account for the seemingly paranormal events? Is there anything about the actual geography of that area that might cause so many ships and aircraft to vanish, apparently without a trace? Well, to start with, the sea currents in the area are heavily affected by the warm Gulf Stream that flows in a northeasterly direction from the tip of Florida to Great Britain and northern Europe. The warm current divides the balmy water of the Saragossa Sea and the colder North Atlantic, and is why the climate in northern Europe is much more moderate than might be expected, considering that Canada and Moscow are as far north as England, and far colder. Once leaving the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf Stream current reaches 5 or 6 knots in speed, and this affects the heavy shipping in the area in many ways, including navigation. In days gone by, before radar and satellite navigation, inexperienced sailors could very easily find themselves many miles off course after failing to measure the ship's speed with sufficient accuracy, especially in the days when this was calculated by throwing from the bow of a ship a log attached to a rope and timing the appearance of each of a series of knots in the rope as it passed by the stern. Failing to do this often enough while sailing in the fast-moving Gulf Stream could quite easily lead a crew of a ship to become hopelessly lost in the vast Atlantic Ocean. Another effect of the fast-moving current would be to scatter the wreckage of lost ships and aircraft over a vast area, many miles from the site of an accident, and very quickly too, making it almost impossible for rescue teams to locate survivors. And then there is the North American continental shelf, which is responsible for the clear blue water of the Caribbean islands. After only a few miles, the shelf gives way to the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean, an area known as the Puerto Rico Trench. And at over 30,000 feet deep, nobody has ever been down there to clear up any mysterious disappearances. And furthermore, the continental shelf is home to large areas of methane hydrates, methane gases that bubble up through the water after being emitted from the seabed. Eruptions from any of these in the relatively shallow waters caused the sea to bubble and froth, affecting the density of the water and hence the buoyancy of the vessels travelling on its surface. Scientific tests have shown that scale models of ships will sink when the density of the water is sufficiently reduced, which could account for some of the sudden disappearances of various craft within the area. Added to which, any wreckage might be carried away by the Gulf Stream and scattered across the Atlantic in no time at all. The Bermuda Triangle is also known for its unusual variations in the Earth's magnetic field. Indeed, this area is only one of 2 places on Earth where a magnetic compass points to true north, determined by the North Star, rather than to magnetic north, located near the Prince of Wales Island in Canada. The only other place where true north lines up with magnetic north is directly on the other side of the planet, just off the east coast of Japan, an area known by the Japanese and Filipino seamen as the Devil's Sea. In both of these areas, navigators not allowing for the usual compass variation between true and magnetic north will become hopelessly lost, and mysterious disappearances are equally common in the Devil's Sea. But locals there don't blame UFOs or sea monsters, they blame human error. Christopher Columbus, the famous 15th century navigator credited with discovering the Americas, was one of the first people to recognize the difference between true and magnetic north. And he wasn't at all fazed by the odd compass readings he seemed to be getting as he sailed between Bermuda and Florida over 500 years ago. These magnetic variations are also thought to be responsible for the fog that appears to cling to aircraft and boats in the Bermuda Triangle and in the Devil's Sea. In such cases, the fog gives the strange illusion that it is travelling along with the craft rather than the boat or plane is travelling through it, creating a tunnelling effect for passengers on board. Many reports have been made of the disorientating effect of this curious fog. In one of the most celebrated instances, the captain of a tug towing a large barge reported that the sea was coming in from all directions, due to methane hydrates no doubt, and that the rope attached to the barge, plus the barge itself only a few yards behind him, appeared to have completely vanished, presumably covered in fog. Another natural phenomenon that might be held responsible for the strange disappearances in the region are hurricanes, notorious in the area of ocean between Bermuda and the Gulf of Mexico, in the middle of which lies the Bermuda Triangle. These must take their fair share of the blame in bringing down small aircraft and swallowing boats, sending the wreckage to the floor of the Atlantic in minutes and leaving no trace of the craft on the surface. So now we know a little bit about the geography and the weather patterns in the area. What really happened in the case of Flight 19, the USS Cyclops, and the Marine Sulphur Queen? Let's examine the first of these disappearances in a bit more detail. Squadron leader Lieutenant Charles Taylor, although an experienced pilot, had only recently been transferred to the air station at Fort Lauderdale and was new to the area. Added to which he was a known party animal and had been out drinking the evening before that fateful flight. The next morning, a very hungover Taylor then tried to find someone else to take over as leader of the training flight, the only point of which was to increase the flying hours of 4 apparent novices. But no other pilot would agree to stand in at such short notice. Soon after the flight took off, Taylor's compass malfunctioned and, unfamiliar with the area, he had to rely on landmarks alone. And after miles of nothing but open sea, the aircraft eventually flew over a small group of islands Taylor thought he recognized as his new home, Florida Keys. All the while, Flight 19 was in constant touch with flight control, and once he thought he realized where he was told to head directly north, which Taylor thought would take him straight back to base. But Flight 19 wasn't over Florida Keys. In fact, it was over the Bermudan Islands, exactly where it should have been. So the order to head north from there simply sent the flight way out into the open sea and miles in the wrong direction, away from land and away from radar contact. Some of the crew members were heard to say to each other they should immediately head west as their compasses were actually working, but none of the trainees dared to contradict their leader. With a storm gathering and the sun not visible through the cloud, Taylor refused to listen to his subordinates anyway, accepting the instruction from the flight control instead. But when told to switch to the emergency radio channel, Taylor declined, stating that one of his pilots could not tune into that particular channel, and he didn't want to lose contact with him. Because of this, contact between himself and Fort Lauderdale became increasingly intermittent. After an hour of flying due north and with no land in sight, Taylor reasoned he must be over the Gulf of Mexico, and with that made a right-hand turn, due east, that he thought would bring his team back to the west coast of Florida. Instead, being an hour north of Bermuda and flying over the Atlantic, with flight control believing them to be close to the Gulf, This manoeuvre only served to take them further out to sea in the direction of Africa and Europe. Flight 19, being miles away from where anybody believed them to be, would then have run out of fuel, ditching into the sea beyond the continental shelf and been broken within minutes by the storm. The mariner sent to look for them was, in fact, one of two that was sent to assist. The first one arrived safely back at base after looking in the wrong area, but the second one exploded shortly after takeoff. The mariners, notorious for fuel leaks, were nicknamed the flying gas tanks. Radio contact had been lost 25 minutes into that flight, and debris floating in a slick of spilt oil was found in the exact location the plane was thought to have come down. So, in a nutshell, there is nothing mysterious about this accident after all. The official report at first stated that flight leader error was to blame for the loss of Flight 19, but this was then changed to cause unknown, giving rise to the mystery. Contrary to the fictitious version of events, nobody has ever stated in an official capacity that the aircraft simply vanished as if they had been flown off to planet Mars, as has been reported. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops does remain a mystery, although heavy seas and hurricanes were reported in the area at the time. It is now thought that a sudden shift in its 11,000-ton metal cargo was to blame, causing the ship to capsize with all hands on deck and sink to the bottom of the ocean. In the case of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen, something triangle enthusiasts rarely mention is that the cargo was made up of 15,000 tons of molten sulphur sealed in 4 giant tanks. It was kept at a heat of 275 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 vast boilers connected to the tanks via a complex network of coil and wire. Nobody ever says that the T2 tankers such as the Marine Sulphur Queen had a terrible record for safety during the Second World War. Within the space of just a few years, 3 of them had previously broken in half and sunk without warning. Indeed, a similar sulphur-carrying ship had vanished in 1954 under less mysterious circumstances, having spontaneously blown up before any mayday calls could be made. But the real evidence for me about what happened comes in one small detail: the fact that crewmen on a banana boat 15 miles off the coast of San Antonio near Cuba reported a strong, acrid odour in the vicinity. The conclusion at the time, but overlooked later by triangle enthusiasts, was either that leaking sulphur must have quickly overcome the entire crew and a spark then ignited the sulphur cloud, causing a fire that the unconscious crew were unable to put out or report, or that a serious explosion had torn through the boat, throwing the crew into the shark and barracuda infested waters. Either way, investigators decided the ship must have gone down just over the horizon from the banana boat, whose crew had reported the sulphurous odour. In addition to natural phenomena, there are man-made ones to consider too when it comes to the Bermuda Triangle. Indeed, the Caribbean and southern Florida have long been a favourite haunt for pirates, and it's not exactly in their interest to report the ships they've sunk after looting their cargo, or crew they've murdered in the process. Many unexplained mysteries would be far better explained by pirate activity than by extraterrestrial abduction or sea monsters lurking in the deep. The real pirates of the Caribbean were not heroes, but vicious murderers who took no prisoners, and left no evidence of their piracy. And don't let Johnny Depp or Keira Knightley tell you otherwise. And so, having studied all the facts, it appears the main explanation for the mysterious events of the Bermuda Triangle is sheer invention. Indeed, there are many examples of writers bending the facts to suit their stories, notably in the case of the Loch Ness Monster and the Mary Celeste. You can listen to those chapters later. Or indeed pretty much every story I've covered in this book. Which is hardly surprising, since mysterious and ghostly goings-on can be very profitable, as we hope to demonstrate, and everyone loves a good mystery. One of my favourite examples of this is the story from 1972 of the appropriately named tanker VA Fog that was said to have been found drifting in the Triangle without a single crew member on board. Everybody had vanished apart from the captain, whose body was found sitting at his desk with a steaming mug of tea in front of him and a haunted look upon his face. He had died from shock, or so the story goes. The truth, however, is rather different, although not lacking in drama of its own. The VA Fog had just delivered a cargo of benzene at the Phillips Petroleum Depot in Freeport, Texas. As it returned through the Gulf of Mexico with its skeleton crew, and I mean that metaphorically in case you're still thinking about pirates, who were cleaning out the fuel tanks when the ship suddenly exploded and sank. The blast created a 10,000-foot-high pool of smoke, and on further investigation the US Coast Guard found the vessel broken in two lying on the seabed 100 feet below the surface. Their photographic record, including the bodies recovered from the sea, is at complete odds with the story told for the benefit of the Bermuda Triangle mystery. Plus, of course, the Gulf of Mexico is not even in the Bermuda Triangle. I don't mean to be a mystery buster, but we do need to get our facts straight. So to resolve the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle once and for all, I've decided to adopt my fail-safe research method of getting to the bottom of things. And that's by finding out who has all the money at stake. I don't mean the documentary makers or the newspapers or television companies. I'm talking about the insurance industry, because it's very much in their interest to have carried out meticulous research into accidents at sea, and we can be fairly certain they will have looked into any so-called mysteries with considerable care. More care than I will. So starting with the largest and oldest marine insurance company in the world, Lloyd's of London, we discover that they certainly did take notice of the Bermuda Triangle reports during the early 1970s and issued a statement to Fate magazine, published on 4th of April 1975. That statement declared that 428 vessels have been reported missing throughout the world since 1955, and that there is no cause to suspect the Bermuda Triangle is swallowing more ships than any other section of ocean. So if Lloyd's of London believe there is no mystery to be found down Bermuda way, then nor should we. But just in case people with minds immeasurably greater than ours are wrong, or even lying to us, then we can do a few calculations of our own. We can start by considering that the surface of the Earth comprises 71% water, an area of 13,900,000 square miles. Now the triangle, at its smallest, depending on which author you believe, as many extend the area to cram as many disappearances into their version of the triangle story as possible, is around 500,000 square miles, about 3.6% of the world's sea area. During the last century, over 50 ships, large and small, and 20 aircraft of all shapes and sizes have come to grief in the Bermuda Triangle. If we use those figures and apply the same principle across the planet, we should expect to have lost around 2,000 craft and boats in total over the last 100 years. Which does sound high. But are 20 accidents per year, large or small, around the world, so unreasonable to imagine? And are the events attributed to the Bermuda Triangle any greater in number than they would be in any other section of the ocean, of comparable size? Other mystery makers point to the statistic of 1,000 craft lost in the Bermuda Triangle since records began. But they fail to add to that records began many centuries ago when Christopher Columbus first sailed west in 1492. That's 500 years. It works out an average of less than 2 disappearances per year. Now that sounds about right to me. That combined with the fact that Coast Guards have known the reason for the loss of craft in almost every case. If people would only bother to ask them, it should stop all the fuss once and for all. This isn't an unusually high percentage of accidents for this area at all in comparison with other parts of the world. The only real surprise is that Lloyd's made any statement at all, because if they'd kept their findings quiet and instead perpetuated the myth, then they could have ramped up their insurance premiums for all shipping in that now infamous stretch of sea.